It is now my pleasure to introduce to you one of our two fiction mentors for this year, Lan Samantha Chang. About 5 years ago, I had talked with Samantha about the possibility of serving as a fiction mentor for this program. She was interested, but said that year wouldn't be particularly good for her as she was expecting a baby. So I made a notation, try again in 4 to 5 years. So anyone who has seen my office knows I don't get rid of anything. So I found that notation when planning for this year and invited her again, and am very happy that she was able to accept the invitation. Samantha Chang has taught at numerous universities and writers' conferences, including Harvard, Stanford, Bread Loaf, and the Asian American Writers' Workshop. She currently serves as the director of the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop. She is the author of the collection Hunger and the novels Inheritance and All Is Forgotten, Nothing Is Lost. The most recent novel is set at a renowned writing school where poetry students strive for the admiration of their mentor. In talking about the genesis of the novel in this morning's seminar, Samantha said that she has always been intrigued by poets in her department and wanted to understand them better. As she stated to the group, "When I'm at work, I can see a qualitative difference between the poets and the fiction writers. An example of this is how they play softball." So this year's participants, be forewarned, there will be a softball tournament at the end of the year, and we invite you all back for that. About Samantha's work, Anna Shin wrote, "Chang's restrained prose enthralls with its sheer elegance, gaining power as much from what is left unsaid as from that which is articulated. She has the rare ability to fashion tales whose cumulative sum is greater than their individual parts. In her characters' lives, one finds a depth of meaning made universal, not despite its specificity, but because of it." What a pleasure it is to hear that work tonight. Please welcome Samantha Chang.
I'm going to drink this water because some thoughtful person put out this beautiful picture in glasses. I have to say that it is such a pleasure to be here at the Loft. I had heard of the Loft years ago when I was actually asked to help screen some of the hundreds of applications for this mentor program. And I thought someday maybe I'll find out more about what that program is about. It seems really neat. And then I get to come up here and I discover this gorgeous building, a wonderful writing community, amazing readers and bookstores and independent presses, and this wonderful city, to the north of us. And it just makes me feel good about everything. It's really wonderful to be here. And also I have to say I'm deeply admiring of Jared because he really does administer this whole thing lovingly and perfectly. And it's just amazing to be here and to experience all of that. And a huge pleasure tonight to read with Martin and Alice. All right, so I decided to read from this novel because it just came out in paperback and because I'm very fond of it. I will say a couple things about it because I'm going to step into the middle of it. I'm going to go past the middle and start and read from about 2/3 of the way through the book. It is about some poets who strive for the admiration of their mentor, whose name is Miranda. And then it jumps forward years after they're in school. So I'm going to skip the entire part that describes what Roman and Bernard, who are good friends, are like when they're in school as aspiring young poets. And I'm going to move into this period in their middle lives. And I should say that Roman has had a falling out with their former mentor Miranda, and Bernard is still in touch with her. And that their lives also diverge in other ways. Roman has taken a job teaching at a university and married a classmate and lives a pretty stable life. And Bernard has sort of decided to live a life of dedication to art. And so he lives in New York and works at a coffee house and is working on his epic poem Forever. Really. And the thing about it, though, is that for various reasons, he's kicked out of his apartment temporarily and he has to go, he's homeless. And so Roman and his wife, who went to grad school with him, decide to take him in. And I'm just going to read a little bit from their reunion, years after they've been in school together. On the evening Bernard was to arrive, Roman left for the bus depot a few minutes early. He drove slowly with the window down, savoring, as if encountering it as a stranger, the delicate heat of a late summer afternoon, with a fierce and fragile light warming the lingering humidity. The faint sound of drums floated through the air. The university marching band had begun its practice for the year, and for the length of the autumn, depending upon the direction of the wind, the blood of everyone in the vicinity of the stadium was stirred by the steady rapping of snares. Reaching the depot, he searched the stream of passengers that emerged, mostly students, tousled from their hours on the bus, blinking as they waited for their overstuffed duffel bags. Amid the stream of students, Bernard appeared on the top step. It was with a jolt of emotion that Roman recognized his friend, the slight, stooped frame, the faintly beaky profile, which had only become more pronounced, more Bernard-like over the years. Bernard followed the other passengers to the pavement and stood looking about him. His eyes were bright, his cheeks flushed, and still hairless, as Roman had expected. He carried a worn brown valise, as Roman had also expected, but instead of a tie, he wore his shirt open at the neck, revealing a small gold cross. He examined Roman minutely, then he smiled. It was the same radiant smile, with its combination of delight and intelligent appraisal. "It's been years," he said. "It's marvelous to see you, Roman." But what did Bernard truly make of him, Roman wondered, years older, pounds heavier? And what did Bernard make of this shabby bus depot, glazed in the pale gold light of an early autumn afternoon? For Roman himself was troubled by, unprepared for the changes in Bernard. Poverty in a young man is thoughtless, presumably a visitor, and worn lightly. With age, it begins to mark the face. Roman had not expected the lines about Bernard's nose and mouth, the features almost undernourished, decidedly eccentric. Moreover, it was confusing to encounter, in the midst of these changes, the piercing, youthful quality of Bernard's gaze, that startling blue clarity, veering toward judgment, which Roman, feeling weary, now recognized as the extremity of innocence. Bernard, at 48, was as good as a stranger, but at the mere sight of him, Roman became aware of the compendium of his own life, organized by time, as if in separate rooms of a house, precious items left to gather dust along with the clutter of years. A door had opened, old possessions uncovered, a part of himself. Okay, now I'm going to skip ahead. What basically happens, I'll just say, is that Bernard stays for a super long time, and it's unclear exactly when he's going to leave. And during that time, having a really sort of long-term house visitor sort of stirs up some things in not only in the relationship between Roman and his wife Lucy, but in Roman's sort of thoughts about himself as a poet and a teacher. And he and Lucy actually get into a major fight. And so I'm just going to skip past the fight and describe what he's doing instead, which is that he decides that he has to be very good now, and he does spend some time cleaning the house. On a Saturday morning in early December, while straightening the room that doubled as Lucy and Avery's studies, Avery is their son, he came upon a manuscript on Lucy's desk. For a queer, suspended moment, he thought it might be a work of her own, the product of some effort she had not revealed to him. But one glance proved otherwise. He sat down at the desk and began to read. He had not finished the first few lines of the poem before he found himself drawn in by its voice. He sat down and read urgently, forgetting about his plan to rake the last few oak leaves from the yard and his promise to Lucy to collect the recycling. He was barely aware of the emotion growing as he read, breaths coming shallower, his mind ringing with wonder. Roman finished the whole manuscript and then reread. After some time he surfaced to the sound of the front door opening and then voices. It was Lucy and Bernard returning from the library. He did not want to see him. He could not yet control his confusion. He took the back stairs down to the recycling bin and hastily loaded the car. It was not until late afternoon that he had a chance to speak to Lucy alone. By then he had had time to think, and he chose his words carefully. "I have to apologize," he said. "I was cleaning up and found Bernard's manuscript. I couldn't help reading it." She glanced at him sideways, unimpressed by the reference to his cleaning. "Oh, what did you think of it?" "It's wonderful," he said, and his words felt inadequate. He was consumed with jealousy, and at the same time an almost metabolic joy, the joy of having discovered something rare, something worth reading. Truly, he felt as if the top of his head were taken off. "It's more than wonderful," he added. "It's astonishing." Lucy said, Miranda told him that if he really wanted to make it perfect, wanted to make it as good as it could be, and for it to become the great work of his life, that he should give it a few more years. Miranda said that? "Isn't Miranda allowed to give advice to Bernard," she said, "as well as to you?" Chagrined, he said, "I don't know what you mean. I was surprised, I think, that's all." He was more than surprised. He was troubled. He hadn't yet been able to sort out the reason. Bernard's long poem was too beautiful, the shock of reading it still recent. His mind rang with the certainty that he had just discovered from an entirely unexpected source a work so plaintive and so lucid, so particularly of its own devising, that he would not recover from its reading for some time. It was a work created from a deep, unusual inner world, a world for which much of ordinary life must have been sacrificed. This, rather than impressing Roman, annoyed him. How had Bernard known? How had he had the confidence, the arrogance to sacrifice so much? "Are you going to tell Bernard?" asked Lucy. "Tell him what?" "What you think about his poems." Roman considered this. "I don't know." "Don't know?" Was her voice a little cold? Roman winced. He had the sense of digging deeper into trouble. "It's simply that you told me a while ago that he read my book," he said gingerly. Once the words were out, he felt petty and fatuous. "Yes?" "Well, I suppose I assumed that if I showed him mine, he would show me his." It sounded silly when he said it. "And yet," he said, struggling to understand the reason for his anxiety, "Bernard and I spent a long time talking, and he never talked about showing me his manuscript. I wonder if it had something to do with how he felt about my manuscript. You said he read it, but he never spoke to me about it." Lucy's glance was brief but challenging. "Why don't you talk to him?" she said. Roman thought for a week, a long week. He taught his final classes, held his grading conferences, and suffered through the composition of several letters of recommendation for Veronica, his student, who wished to attend writers' colonies and apply for fellowships. Each evening there was dinner and conversation with Bernard, whom he could not help seeing in a new way. Now the oddities of Bernard, which he had once thought charming, rankled. Why, for example, did Bernard not learn to drive? Did he feel himself to be above such mundanities? Was he saving the strength wasted by others on transportation for his poetry? He thought about Bernard sleeping for 2 months in his attic, reading his books, sitting at his desk. Suddenly it became intolerable that he would have no use of his desk during the remainder of Bernard's visit. Each morning he found himself pacing in circles in the bedroom directly below the desk, imagining Bernard seated there making his usual minute notes in pencil. On Friday, Roman suggested to Bernard that they drive to Omaha for lunch. I don't have class today, he said, and you've hardly seen the sights, although you've been here for almost 3 months. The words were hardly from his mouth when he realized that 3 months was a very long time, and Bernard's visit of punishing length. The temperature was dropping rapidly, too soon for the season, and the gray air felt heavy with an impending shock of early winter cold. They parked in a garage and walked to an Italian restaurant Roman knew, where he and Lucy had gone on a few special occasions. He felt obliged to choose a good restaurant, obliged to make the meal expensive. Since he had finished reading the long poem, his friend had taken on a kind of weight and stature in his mind. He ordered a large meal and persuaded Bernard to help him with a bottle of wine. As they ate and drank, they discussed the books some of their classmates had recently published. They talked about Roman's colleague Spencer Davis, as well as some poets Bernard had met in Manhattan. Bernard said nothing about his long poem, or whether he had heard news of his apartment, or when he was planning to go back to New York. When they were finished, Roman picked up the check. As they stood to leave, he said to Bernard, "Lucy tells me you read my manuscript." Bernard turned slightly away, troubled. "I didn't mean to keep it from you," he began. Then he pulled his gloves from his pocket. Roman wondered if they had discussed more about the manuscript than Lucy had revealed. The heaviness of the lunch, the strength of the coffee, made him wish he had not introduced the subject. "I know," he said. To forestall Bernard's opinion, he thinned and lightened his voice to imitate the question Miranda had asked so long ago. "Is this a poem?" Bernard looked at Roman, then at his gloved hands. "It's poetry," he said. Roman waited, and when Bernard did not elaborate, he felt himself on the verge of trying to express the suspicion that had been growing in him over the summer. He had told no one of the feeling, not even Lucy, and he had the sense only just now, and with this listener, of being able to put it into words. "It's not poetry," he said. "It's gnawing on the bones of poetry." Bernard said, winding a narrow red scarf around his neck, "Its insight and breadth is extremely impressive, and the voice is much more convincingly rendered than in any work I've seen of yours before." "But you don't like it," Roman asserted. "I didn't say anything like that." "But you don't." They left the warmth of the restaurant reluctantly and set off down the street toward the parking garage. While they were at lunch, the weather had turned suddenly to deep winter, and an icy wind drove into them, bringing water to the eyes. Bernard bent his head into the wind. His expression, Roman thought, was strangely aggrieved, or perhaps it was the cold. "It's not quite that, Roman." His voice seemed to echo more loudly outside the restaurant. "Your poems have become in many ways astonishing, really." "But you don't think I've improved much, do you, over the years?" Roman's own voice rang with an uncomfortable clarity against the iron-cold sidewalk. I have an odd opinion about all of this, as you know." "What do you mean?" "To be honest," Bernard said, "I don't think that most of us ever truly improve." They entered the imposing ramp where Roman had parked the car. As they climbed the stairs, Roman felt a dull pulsing behind his temples. He stopped walking for a moment and waited for it to recede. There was something almost menacing in Bernard's words that made it difficult for him to think. "What do you mean by that?" Bernard spoke slowly and evenly. "I don't think we get better during our lives. Most of us get worse. And the others, well, perhaps they write better books, but they don't improve. Our truest limitations are not technical. I said it years ago. Poetry cannot be taught. All of this instruction of technique is merely superstition, magical thinking, wishful people tinkering over a decision made for them long ago." "That's not true," Roman said, cutting off the thought with a gesture of his hand. But he himself had often wondered about this question. "Of course it's possible to improve from learning craft," Roman continued, lamely. "It's possible to write a better book, perhaps, but not to become a better poet." "Give me an example." "From our own generation? Well, Bob Lou. His last collection had some lovely poems, but you can't say he has improved or even lived up to the promise of his early work." Roman drew himself up to argue. It was not true, not in every case. For one thing, Bernard had become a better poet. His long poem was stunning. In the years since graduate school, it had transformed from something slightly pedestrian or even dull to a beautiful, shining object, a shimmering design of words and images. But Roman could not say this to Bernard. Bernard had very deliberately kept the poem away from him. Moreover, it seemed not through an accrual of craft that he had grown. It was not craft, but a sense of surety, as if during those years, in his isolation, Bernard had refined from his anachronistic forms, his distant friendships, and his suffering, for Roman suspected now there had been suffering, a piercing clarity of feeling. This was poetic vision. No amount of craft could ever make up for it. "Where's the car?" Bernard asked, and Roman was suddenly aware that he had no memory of where he had parked. He thrust his hands into his pockets. The cold was penetrating, raw, even in the garage where the wind raced between levels. The concrete numbed his feet. For several minutes he walked silently up and down the rows of cars. Bernard followed uncomplainingly, although his corduroy coat was, Roman noted, too thin and too short for winter in Nebraska. But would he stay the whole winter? Roman, stopped short by the question, forgot for a moment if he had taken his car or Lucy's. And had he, Roman, not improved as a poet? How could he ask Bernard about this? "But you think it's true," he said, his voice making shameful puffs of steam. "You do think it's gnawing on the bones. You do." They had reached the edge of the second floor. "Damn," he added, "I was sure I had parked on the second level." They climbed, colder every moment, to the third level. Roman felt again the blood throbbing in his temples. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but his stubborn, unspoken question lingered. And after a moment, Bernard said, "You could show it to Miranda. I'm sure she'd love to see it. It would be a comfort for her to read such fine work from a former student, and she would tell you what you needed to know." The name, coming unexpected, assaulted him. "No," he said. "Are you angry at Miranda?" Bernard asked. In his own way, Bernard had fumbled toward the problem. He was not precisely correct, but he was too close. "It's complicated," Roman said. He clenched his hands in his pockets. He could not feel his fingers, but his head was pounding now. "My work was never her favorite, if you'll remember from class. I've moved beyond her aesthetically and in a number of other ways." "I don't mean to intrude," Bernard said, "but I have sensed for some time that you are upset with Miranda, and from something you said long ago in New York, I have suspected that your concern has to do with an impression of yours that she, at one point in your career, attempted to be possessive of your accomplishments in some way." "I never said that," Roman said. "You didn't in so many words, but it has seemed to me, as I have learned more about the lives of many artists and their most important teachers, that there can come a rift in the relationship at the point of emerging, where the student begins to feel that the teacher assumes too much credit, if you can call it that, for the achievements of the student. I know she was proud to have worked with you, but I'm sure that she in no way expects to be thought responsible for your success." Roman gritted his teeth. "Look," he said, "we just had a kind of falling out." "How did that happen?" "Long ago," said Roman. "The cold had seized him up, and he was shaking. We were only a few years out of graduate school." "You haven't contacted her since?" "I don't see any reason to do so." Bernard's teeth chattered, but he spoke clearly and decisively. "Well, this might be a good time to do it. You might want to let her know that you appreciate all the help she gave you. She was largely responsible for getting you started out, you know." It was one of the few things Bernard could have said to hurt him. Moreover, Bernard must know that it would hurt him. Why had he said it? Roman said, "And you think I owe her a debt of gratitude? And that she would be happy to hear from me, despite our falling out, after all these years, as long as I make it clear to her that I approach from a position of gratitude?" "Yes." "And I suppose you know all about that, Bernard, from your years of experience in human relationships." Bernard looked up at him, pinched and shivering, hurt, and not bothering to hide this hurt. It was this lack of guardedness, this almost aggressive lack of it, that bothered Roman most of all. He turned away. There, in the far corner, was his car. It needed a wash. although Roman assumed Bernard would not notice or care. They got into the car, shaking as they sat down on the cold, cold seats. Roman turned on the heat, producing a loud and irritating blowing sound. They began to wind their way slowly out of the garage. Bernard sat in the corner with his red nose in his scarf. He had brought a palpable sense of injury with him. Unable to control himself, Roman pushed further. "Why won't you tell me what you think of my new poems?" "Roman, I don't understand why you are so determined to hear my thoughts." Roman paused, perplexed by a sudden inexplicable fury. He felt truly sorry for the lunch, sorry he had embarked upon the conversation. The garage was crowded with winter shoppers. They drove in circles with several cars waiting at each turn. The air was thick with exhaust. It was torture, Roman thought. It was taking forever. "Because I want to know what you really think," he said finally. "It's more than that. I need to know." Bernard shook his head. "Why do you need to know?" he asked. "What could you possibly need from me?" "Come on, you owe it to me," Roman burst out. "You've been living in my studio for 3 months. Bernard straightened in his seat. His eyes were very blue and his cheeks still red with cold. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean that," Roman said. "Come on, Bernardo. You know we're happy to have you here." "I do owe you," Bernard said. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes fixed past the windshield. Roman felt suddenly afraid of what he was about to say. He clenched his hands around the wheel to keep from shaking. Bernard drew a deep breath. "I think this next manuscript will be very well received." Then Bernard paused, seemingly to think exactly how to put his thoughts into words. "If you wish me to be absolutely honest, Roman, I suppose my thoughts don't have to do with an imagined life, this collection, specifically. I've simply wondered generally about your choice of the form of the dramatic monologue." Roman opened his mouth, but before he could formulate his question, Bernard went on. "You're good at it, extraordinarily good, so good that it should not have to matter, but I wonder if there might be something, well, territorial or even boastful about the form itself. I mean in the idea that one could inhabit the subject matter, as if, in speaking as others, one might become so certain, so in control, that the imagined world, when the book is read, is a bubble that glistens, untouched by life." Here Bernard paused again. "Although the mother is permitted to speak, she speaks not as herself, but as the poet wishes her to speak. The things she says are things the poet wishes her to say. Roman, yourself is never present in the poems. You seem to risk nothing." Now Bernard was reaching for his pocket. Roman wondered if he was looking for a handkerchief. His own head was ringing as if he had been struck. They arrived at the booth. Roman fumbled to roll down the windows and then handed the ticket to the attendant. "That'll be $2.25, the attendant said. With their meandering in the cold, the car had been 3 hours parked in the garage. Bernard thrust some bills at Roman. "I'm paying," Roman said. His voice rang loud and flat in the small space. "I have the money," Bernard said. "No," Roman said, and he pushed away Bernard's hand. As they left the garage, Roman turned on the radio, and they sat for the hour back to Lincoln without speaking. Roman drove numbly, his mind a throbbing, static space. Over and over, he felt the thrust of his arm, pushing away Bernard and his $3. Thanks.